So thank you for everyone who's here so far. Really have been looking forward to a chance to talk to Aaron Rupar with Public Notice. We've been in contact for a good while, but we haven't really had a chance to do a conversation like this. So for those who follow me but don't know Aaron, let me just say a couple of things. He was a former editor at Vox, I believe, in politics and policy. He was an editor at Think Progress before launching Public Notice at Substack in 2021. Uh, Probably a lot of people, maybe most people in the wider world, sort of know you because you're the guy who clips political videos that often go viral. And I don't know how you feel about that being a claim to fame, but there it is. Let's talk about that for a minute. Why do you do it, and what do you hope people get from that?
Yeah, I really kind of stumbled into it back in 2017 when I was at Think Progress. As you mentioned, I was an editor, and part of my job there was to kind of blog about Trump because mainly, I was helping manage a team of reporters who was doing a lot of on the ground reporting. So they would go to, either kind of like labor events or, out in the country and do interviews and then, send copy back to the newsroom. And that was kind of my job was to edit, and just kind of make sure that the finished product looked good on the site and help assign stories and things like that. But we needed someone in the newsroom to cover Trump. And so that kind of fell to me. And, we had coincidentally, while I was in that role, training on this product called Snapstream, which I still use today. And I used it kind of on a lark to post a short clip of John Kelly, who was then the White House chief of staff, on Laura Ingraham's show, where he was kind of making this heritage, not hate defense of Confederate monuments. This is right after the Charlottesville demonstration and counter demonstrations, and it blew up more so than anything I had posted on
Hmm.
my Twitter account. So right away, it kind of became clear to me that there was a big demand for video clips. And now we're kind of living through this again with Trump being back in the White
Yeah,
House. How it's kind of over the top his events can be, newsworthy in a lot of respects too, but they make for kind of compelling clips. And so, it just became kind of a part of my normal workflow and,
right.
help kind of blow up my social accounts. And here I am 8 years later. So it's nothing I ever expected to do, but it really helped kind of make a name for myself in political journalism.
So has it gotten harder now just because there's so much? I mean, look, we know about the sort of the daily dreadful acceleration, the flood of garbage into the public sphere, executive orders and the like. I'm just curious about, and this is, I think, one of my challenges, which is deciding where to focus, right? Where to spotlight, which are the stories that really demand attention. How tricky has that been for you, sort of given the overwhelming amount of stuff?
Yeah, I think overwhelming is a good word just in that, there's so much going on and there's so many different channels to clip from, that, it is hard to know how to sort of prioritize my attention. But I do have it down to kind of a process at this point where, the first thing I do obviously is kind of push out my newsletter every morning on all my different channels. But then,
Right.
I go through Maria Bartiromo's show, I go through CNBC, Morning Joe, CNN, and I kind of a process for ripping through them based on who the guests are. So, like this morning, Comer was on Newsmax and he was also on Fox Business. And so when I see his face as I'm fast forwarding through the show, I'll stop and kind of lock in on what he's saying. Or, for instance, like on the first Friday of every month, when the jobs report comes out, I make sure to watch Maria Bartiromo's real time reaction to that. Of course, that was always really entertaining during the Biden years because she'd have to try to find ways to spin really negative reports. And now it can be kind of the opposite, where it's a bad report, but she's trying to make it sound great. So I've kind of over the years figured out like where you can get the most newsy tidbits.
Right.
And I'm just one person. I don't, people often think I have like a team working with me, and it's just me.
Yeah.
Other than the contributors who are writing
You
for the
work
newsletter.
fast, but by
Yes.
necessity.
Right. So, and there's also, now because as opposed to when I started doing this, where there weren't that many people doing clipping. And so I kind of
Yeah.
had the whole landscape mostly to myself. Now it's become obviously quite saturated. There's other accounts who are individuals who post clips. There's, institutional accounts, media outlets that do it. And so there is kind of that timeliness to it where, if there's something really newsworthy happening on cable or on a stream at a congressional hearing, Not only, is there kind of the challenge of completeness trying to get to everything every day, but there also is, you want to get to the really compelling stuff as quickly as you can.
Right.
So like, I kind of hone my techniques as I go and figure out
Right.
what works or what doesn't. But as opposed to kind of I sort of stumbled into it. At first, I didn't really have a big process for it. But now I sort of have a sense every day, where I'm going to find the good stuff that, will help
Yeah.
grow my social accounts.
Yeah. So one more thing on this, which is, so over the weekend there was a clip that appeared. I don't know if it came from you or where it came from Scott Pelley's commencement address at Wake Forest, where he, really laid into the attack that journalism and free speech and the country is under, sort of given this rise of fascism, and I thought it was courageous and all that. It was a specific, I'm going to say 30 seconds or so, that was the clip that made the rounds and has generated a lot of backlash against Pelly. And what struck me, I made a point because I wrote about it. I made a point of going back and looking at the entire commencement address. And he had a lot of other really interesting and important things to say that helped you to understand, where he was coming from and what it was that he was trying to communicate and why he felt and feels the responsibility that he does. And so, for me, it was an example. We may pick that viral moment, but I always worry about whether the public is really being informed in the process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did see that clip making the rounds. I didn't post it. Actually, I tried this past weekend to sort of unplug a little bit, which can be
Yeah,
really challenging in its own right.
got
But I
to
mean,
do it sometimes.
yeah, you're absolutely right, and I run into that a lot, especially with congressional hearings. Because some of these hearings are 7, 8 hours long, and so almost by necessity, you're taking things a bit out of context because if you posted the entire 7 minutes questioning period for a member, a Congress member or a senator, that's not going to make it's not going to be very compelling for people. Like part of the service you provide is kind of boiling it down to the moment that you need to see. So I'm always personally very cognizant of trying not to present things out of context. So
Right,
if you have to include a little bit more in the clip, even if that becomes kind of a disincentive for people to watch it because now it's 2 minutes long instead of a minute long, like I'd rather do it that way than open yourself up to accusations that you're taking a soundbite out of context and you're kind of misrepresenting what the actual intention of what was being said was.
right.
But you're right. I mean that it is a challenge, and with the Pelly, I did not watch the whole speech. I did see the clip that you're talking about that obviously blew up, and so I was assuming as just a consumer of that clip that it was representative of kind of the tone of what he was saying, and it sounds like maybe there was. If not, I guess what you're saying is that there were other moments that could have also,
Yeah,
met
that were
the
also
yeah,
extremely important. And look, you
yeah.
make choices, and I want to talk for a minute about independent media and legacy media, and it's this particular discussion is interesting because the choices that we make. We're not under the same pressures in terms of where to focus the attention. So one of the things that I'm struck by is the opportunity, rather than just give the soundbite, and I mean just quote in my piece that one little moment, or two or three. Sometimes I'll actually do longer passages from a speech because I think it's important for people to get context and to get understanding. And I know that I'm breaking with sort of journalistic expectations that your quotes are a couple of sentences and then move on. Sometimes there's a need and I think a real value for, again, in the way I look at it, an informed citizenry to take a moment to give people more context so they can really understand at a little bit deeper level what the thinking is of whether it's somebody that we agree with or somebody who's a an absolute danger to democracy. So let me ask you this. We both made the decision to focus on independent media. We both have had backgrounds with, more sort of traditional legacy media. I have with lots of different newspapers and magazines over the years. I'm grateful for the freedom that I have to be able to say what I think and to articulate what I feel and to provide a point of view, and to do it without, frankly, an editor who's standing over me and saying, not that, not that, not that. So I'm making a judgment that either resonates with my readers or it doesn't, but it gives people at least a chance to know more fully what I'm thinking. So I'm curious, sort of given the, in my view, the failure of legacy media, during the first term to recognize the danger of Trump and the rising potential of authoritarianism, which I think is part of the reason we're in this predicament now. And it seems to me with the capitulation of people like Jeff Bezos at Washington Post and so forth, owners of CBS, there's a lot of pressure now to capitulate to Trump. So I'm curious, sort of your view uh, about the importance of independent media now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to highlight, the CBS situation, the ABC settlement, which was a pretty frivolous case in that instance as well, and just some of these pressures that I think are unique this term and different than Trump 1.0, where obviously he attacked the media relentlessly, but there wasn't this kind of shakedown aspect that we're now becoming familiar with, and that I think would make it really challenging. If you're working on 60 Minutes, or if you're working on ABC's This Week show, which was the target of that lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos. I was fortunate when I was working, obviously Think Progress was a progressive outlet, and
Right,
Vox, certainly I would say is left leaning. But I did have some experience even there, which was one of the reasons that I went independent was, I was covering Trump at Vox, and then after January 6th, there was this sense from higher ups there that, which is, I think, an accurate way to think about Trump, was that he was using his words to incite violence at that time, especially on January 6th, and using his social media channels. And if you remember, he had a string of rallies just before January 6th that ostensibly were for the elections down in Georgia for those two Senate seats, but that really became, kind of venues for him to organize and incite January 6th, and, kind of promote the idea that the election had been stolen from him. And so there was an edict from some of the higher ups at Vox that within their coverage, they no longer wanted to be, with some exceptions, directly quoting Trump or including video of him in reports about what was going on, because there was kind of the sense that, if the wrong person saw it, it could kind of like radicalize them, basically. And to me, that really, was challenging to
mm,
adapt to, because, it's hard enough to cover Trump. And I prided myself on being, effective at doing it, where you're putting his words into context, you're debunking him when necessary, and kind of fact checking. But then when you have to kind of triangulate, where it's like, well, I can't show him and I can't
yeah,
quote him, and so how do I talk about this?
yeah.
And so
When
that
to
was actually, yeah.
when amplify. It's. I don't know about you, but I feel it's almost a daily thing of when do you share some of those appalling passages in his Truth Social. We're over, for example, Memorial Day weekend. He's going on about the scum of the earth, which is essentially half of the American population or more. It's sort of like, do you want to amplify it, or do you not want to?
Absolutely, and that's a very challenging question to grapple with every single day. When he's on camera as much as he is, and obviously the things like his Memorial Day bleat. The one about like the losers, or whatever he was saying, kind of like Happy Memorial Day even to the losers, and so
Yeah,
on and so on. Clearly, he's doing that as kind of like a troll, and so you don't want to be used by him to kind of further his own ends in that way. But I also think it's important to kind of, 'cause you and I are immersed in this stuff, and so we know what Trump's up to, and we know kind of what the policy program is, and sort of the lawlessness and how he's pushing boundaries. But a lot of people don't, and
yeah,
so because I have a large reach, especially on X and on Blue Sky, I do try to provide that service of watching so that people don't have to,
yeah.
and when appropriate, contextualizing what he's saying so that so that people know when he's lying. I mean, it does become challenging, because like, how many times can you point out that the 2020 election wasn't stolen? I mean, at a certain point, you just kind of assume that, either people know what the truth is, or, they're kind of lying to themselves,
Yeah.
and they've chosen to believe this lie. So I don't, it just becomes obnoxious, and kind of almost too much to ask to, like, every single time Trump mentions that the election was rigged, to include in parentheses, no, it wasn't. But sometimes I still have to do things like that. But that's one of the unique challenges of covering Trump and this Republican Party, as we're living through right now with the reconciliation bill and the lies that they're pushing with, no, we're not cutting Medicaid, we're just removing
Right.
illegal
They're
immigrants from
not
the
really
program, which is not
they
true.
wouldn't
Yeah.
really do that to us, would they?
Right. But so that those are really important lies to push back on, because again, these are things that kind of permeate the consciousness of the voters that end up deciding these elections, and so you want them to be informed about what's going on. And so, to the extent I can reach those people, which is kind of limited, but some of them follow
Sure.
me. I think it's important to point out what the truth is, and to highlight the lies. And so, There is that kind of tension between highlighting the lies, pushing back on them, debunking them, and not amplifying
And
them.
spread right.
And yeah, yeah,
Right, and look, I think part of the challenge, I've been writing about, normalcy bias, right? For people to think, oh, it's not really that bad, and oh, don't worry, this isn't really going to turn into a crisis or a catastrophe. Let's not assume that people want to believe that things are going to be normal like they have been. They don't want to think of the worst case scenario, but I think he's gotten away with an awful lot because people thought like he wasn't really that bad. Oh, he didn't really mean that. Oh, he wasn't serious about that. Oh, he wouldn't really do that in the second term. No, he didn't really mean it when he said he wants to be a dictator on day one, quote unquote.
yeah.
So he has been able to exploit that normalcy bias, I think, for now going on a decade. So let's talk about the crisis, the whatever way you want to put it. I'll talk about the authoritarian crisis. And I was encouraged on Friday. The New York Times published a summary of 177 lawsuits that they made the point that, at least on a temporary basis, have succeeded in stopping the efforts by Trump to and his regime to dismantle the government and end policies that have been in place and funding that had been in place and so on and so forth. That's 177 lawsuits. It's not everything, but I found it encouraging. Which isn't to say that we aren't in a crisis. I'm curious, sort of, for you to sort of say, where do you think we are, and at this point, with what we've learned on a day-to-day basis, how resilient do you think our democracy is?
Well, first of all, I mean, I completely agree with the framing of this as a crisis. And, I think that we're seeing from the administration a lot of malicious compliance and also, kind of moving of the goalposts. One notable example being the Abrego Garcia case, where, there's a Supreme Court ruling ordering the administration to facilitate his return. And then we've spent, the 2 months since then kind of the administration has playing semantics with what does facilitate mean. And you can see how they can kind of drag these things out to the point where it basically becomes defying a court order in spirit, if not, in practice. And so, I think like with the, right now the attacks on Harvard and the efforts to ban international students from
Right.
studying there. I mean, that was there was a temporary restraining order issued like within it was within like 20 minutes
Yeah.
of
Right
Harvard
after our
filing.
complaint. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's certainly important, and it's better than nothing. But I think the true crisis is that Congress has completely given up any sort of oversight of Trump. They're obviously Republicans are 100% and maybe a few exceptions on the margins behind his agenda. And so I think as long as that is the case, and we have a basically a totally compliant majorities in both chambers of Congress, I think the administration is going to keep pushing boundaries and defying court orders and seeing what they can get away with. And so I certainly think it's preferable that the courts are standing up in some instances, compared to the alternative where they were
Yeah.
just kind of getting rolled and going along with everything that Trump wants to do. So that is a good thing. But I think there are limitations on that. And I think that we're seeing that no one has really gotten to the bottom of exactly what's going on with like the trying to freeze all of the research funding at universities. And obviously these are really harmful things that could have ripple effects that last decades. And
Yeah.
it seems like because they're so intent on doing that, that even in instances where courts put a roadblock up, they seem so intent that they're going to find ways, I fear, around those to kind of realize their ends. And so I'm glad the courts are proving to be a limited check on Trump, but I think we really need Congress to do more and to take Trump's lawlessness more seriously, and serve that oversight function that is supposed to be one of the key checks and balances in our democracy.
Yeah, look, we are paying for a Supreme Court that gave Trump, near total immunity. And and when you put a reckless criminal like that in a position who is going to exploit that immunity at the maximum level, no one should be surprised. And look, that includes the fact that as the judges, and I mean sort of more widely, the judicial branch, whoever appointed them, there has been largely the pushback which is to say to try to uphold the law and try to uphold things like due process. Hello, and the the necessity of habeas corpus. Hello, these things shouldn't be complicated in our democracy and our judicial system, but this is a daily fight. And the fact that he has been inciting death threats against justices, I mean judges of all kinds. They said that sort of since between March 1st and April 14th, just a data point, 162 judges were facing threats,
Mhm.
277 since he took office. There in the last day, sort of Cory Booker actually sort of pushed out a bill to move the U.S. Marshal Service from the executive branch to the judicial branch
Mm.
because the judges can't even trust that they're going to be protected right now by in essence Trump's marshals. So the fact that they've been able to at least maintain as much independence as they have has does encourage me. It gives me hope that they're going to continue to be at least something of a buffer for this. But it raises questions about, for me, who's the bump? Who's the buffer now? Scott Pelley, he spoke out. That's great. Harvard with a 52, 53 billion, dollar endowment has the power and the wealth to be able to stand up to Trump and say that they're not going to go along with these efforts to essentially let him take over the running of the university. Obviously, a lot of other universities around the country and schools and colleges have followed suit with that. Um, I'm curious about where, I want to get to public protests. I mean, that's sort of where I want to get to. But I mean, where do you see? I mean, who are the voices and maybe organizations that sort of encourage you the most?
Oh boy.
That's a lot.
That's yeah, that is a lot. I mean, I'm trying to think what's encouraging me. I mean, it's kind of it's fairly scant, unfortunately, in terms
Yeah,
of the direction that things are headed in this country. I mean, I do think again, the ruling in the Harvard case coming as quickly as it did, it was encouraging that courts in a case where it was a clearly lawless action are willing to at least call that out and put a break on what Trump is trying to do. The attack on Harvard, the attack on kind of higher education more broadly, and foreign students, basically trying to strip legal protections from them, which God knows what that could setting them down to a detention center in Louisiana or worse. But in terms of organizations kind of beyond the courts, I mean, I think there are a lot of Democrats who are effectively messaging, which is kind of
mm,
unfortunately, I mean, there's not a whole lot more really to be done. I do think, Democratic senators could do a little bit more to kind of throw sand in the gears of the Senate, maybe shut things down. But, this is kind of unfortunately the predicament that voters put Democrats in is, being minorities in both chambers, obviously not having the White House. So I guess that's been the thing that in terms of why I'm not feeling super encouraged is
yeah,
that, I thought
mm,
the choice last November couldn't have been much clearer than it was. And, it
yeah.
felt like
Hello.
a lot of people were kind of working overtime to find reasons not to do the clearly rational and sane voting choice or make that
Right.
choice. And so, we're living with kind of the fallout
Here
from
we are.
that. And unfortunately, just given the way our system works, we're going to have to live with this for another year and a half at least. And so, in terms of what encourages me, I guess, I am a little bit encouraged that it seems like in key fronts of Trump's attack on our civil society institutions, have been thwarted or at least slowed down to the point where, I do still have some hope that by the time we get to January 2027, that key pillars of our democracy hopefully will still be in place and there will be
Yeah,
kind of, a country and we're salvaging still at that point. But I think, people, I've been very sympathetic to worries that a lot of smart people have been expressing about, even whether the elections next year will be free and
yeah,
fair. I mean, I
yeah,
certainly think in places like New York, California, Illinois, Minnesota, where I am presently, we're going to have free and fair elections here. But a state like North Carolina, we just saw efforts that Republicans made there to steal a state Supreme Court seat. Could there be antics like that next year in states where Republicans have more power? To possibly overturn key congressional elections, to kind of rig the game for Republicans. So I am worried about that next year. I'm encouraged that, after kind of the shock and awe of Trump's first 100 days,
yeah.
things seem to be slowing down a little bit right now. It gives me hope that the country will survive. But yeah, in terms of beyond that, my morale has been higher certainly in the past than it is now.
Yeah. Well, look, I appreciate that, and and can I say, let's sort of put it in context a little bit. I when I launched America, America, 4 years ago, I sort of said this is about hope and alarm. I wanted to, ring the alarm bells as much as needed, but I also wanted to give people hope about the future, and that that ebbs and flows. The proportions are changing all the time, and there are unsurprisingly a lot of days, a lot of weeks. It's awfully hard to identify the reasons for hope, but I and optimism. But I also think it's very important that people don't feel powerless. I think it's important that people do feel some sense of agency and do understand that it's important to reach out to your elected officials, and it's important to show up at a protest at a Tesla showroom, and it's important for you to participate in whatever way you can. Defend your neighbor who might be facing a threat. Be kind to your neighbor. Do those basic things that help to keep a civil society in place, and speak out in whatever forms. You and I have platforms, but everyone should feel the responsibility, in my view, the opportunity to speak out, to stand up in whatever way whatever way they can. Whether it's a Facebook post, or whether it's talking to your sibling, or talking to your neighbor, or you know striking up a conversation with a stranger in a grocery store. I mean, I just think that all of these things are inch by inch part of the way that we hold on to the fabric of the society. And look, I've spent a lot of time focusing on this question of public protest and drawing on the Harvard research that says if you have 12 million people in the streets, and that represents 3.5% of the population, at least, that you have the ability to begin to drive political change, that it's the kind of numbers that begin to have the ability to, if clearly defined message and clearly defined sort of redress that you're seeking, that's sort of the scale, and not just sort of once every so often, but as a sustained political effort that can really make a difference. And so my view is that we have to be moving toward that kind of public protest to really enact a change here. But the thing is, it can't be about everything. It has to be about something. It has to be
Mhm.
about a finite number of targets. And so, look, with Elon Musk and Tesla, there was a very specific focus, which I think has had a positive effect. With Trump, maybe it's to drive him out of the office, but the question is, what will be the catalyst for change that would actually generate that kind of a public response? And I'm looking at things like the corruption, right? $400 million jumbo jet, and 2 billion invested by Abu Dhabi, and cryptocurrency business. The dinner with the crypto investors where Trump raised over $148 million. All of these things, which are essentially to put money in his pocket. The same thing with all of these pardons that were, for no good reason except to enrich him. And so, what's the thing? Is it corruption?
Mhm.
Is it pardons? Is it cuts of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid? What is it? What do you think it is that might actually lead us in that direction?
Yeah, I think the Medicaid cuts are huge. There was a moment that I was looking at just before we hopped on this, that MSNBC played a clip of Michael. I think his name is Michael Flood, a Nebraska rep, Republican, who had a town hall last night, and people were heckling him, and he had to eventually kind of admit, or he lied. He basically said, "Oh, the cuts to Medicaid, I didn't even realize that those were in the bill that I voted for." And it was kind of this viral moment because people were jeering him, and clearly either he was kind of confessing to really profound ignorance about this thing he had just voted on, or he was lying, and both are obviously really bad. So it's kind of moments like that, that gives me some hope that maybe scenes like that could put some pressure on this guy, either to make a more responsible vote when it comes back to the House next time after the Senate changes it, or can kind of inspire someone to try to defeat him in next year's election. In a district of Nebraska that isn't super red. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a little more cynical with the corruption and things like that, because we already lived through one term of Trump,
Right.
and
This is
the
at a
corruption.
scale, right? I mean, doesn't at some point does the scale of brazenness finally begin to crack through?
I wish. Again, I feel like it's been really out there. I mean, this guy was selling shoes during the campaign.
Yeah,
I feel like sadly, the electorate's kind of desensitized to that stuff, and I think the media takes some blame for kind of normalizing the corruption too. But I mean, we knew that the first term he was running a hotel by the White House, and
yeah,
he was having the Secret Service stay at his properties, and now the crypto thing obviously takes it to a whole different sort of level, and you're right to point out the jet from Qatar. As shameless as it gets, but I think Trump has kind of pegged the electorate in the sense that he believes that it's not going to really move the needle, and that
yeah,
the 35% of the country that loves him is going to love him kind of regardless. And so that's why I think the more fertile ground are policy actions that are actually going to harm people, like Medicaid, hobbling the
right.
Social Security Administration.
Tariff
Um, with
prices.
tariffs, prices. I mean, even the FAA dysfunction. People fly, they get worried about their family members flying. Those to me are kind of, I would love if we lived in a country that was sane to the point where, the egregious corruption of Trump would be impeachable and disqualifying. But
Yeah,
I just think we lived through this, and I just don't.
yeah,
It didn't move the needle the first time. I don't really think it's moved. I would love to be wrong, but
yeah.
I just don't see it.
Well, look, I mean, let's take South Korea as an example. They saw the corruption of their president, and they took to the streets, and it led to change. I mean, I think we can look around the world where corruption seems to have more impact. And I don't disagree at all with you. I mean, people saw this guy first term. They've obviously, built this into the equation about him, and have chosen to tolerate it. I guess the question is, as he and his fellow oligarchs get richer and richer, and the economy gets poorer, and people's ability to pay for their basic necessities becomes more difficult because of these, in my view, these absolutely moronic tariffs that are, you know, dismantling our relations around the world. Does that combination finally motivate people to say, like, this is enough? I mean, it's this question, and I honestly I ask it every day: when is enough enough? Right? When
Yeah.
people say, like, this is the thing, and I'm just not gonna take it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I live in a little town in Minnesota that is like a 65% Trump community, and there's a big Walmart here. And to me, it's always like it's going to take the people who voted for Trump going to Walmart, and the basket of stuff that they bought. They're used to paying $70 for, it costs $100. Like that. That's the type of thing that I think will get people kind of questioning what's going on, or wondering about the policy decisions that are being made. By the president that they supported. And I don't think we've gotten there yet.
Yeah,
Obviously, when we had the 145% tariff on China, and it was basically an embargo. I was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, where it's like, okay, when are these Walmart shoppers going to be feeling the pain? And I don't. The administration kind of talked a big game about, like, oh, I believe these big retailers kind of stocked up ahead of time, and maybe they did, because I haven't really seen those price increases yet. Aside from products on the margins, and so, but I think that's, I just think unfortunately that's the type of society that we live in, is that it's going to have to hit people in their wallets basically, before they become motivated to really kind of take action in any sort of way that's going to shake the status quo up.
yeah,
Even look at the stocks are pretty much flat from the inauguration. Maybe there's kind of a downturn on the horizon. Certainly, I think the trade uncertainty hurt the stability of the economy, and it is weakening the economy. But I don't think things have gotten so bad that there's been kind of like a sea change at this point, and maybe that'll happen over the course of the summer. I'm not sure, but I think we were all waiting for that a month ago after the Liberation Day tariffs on April 2nd were announced. I think we were all kind of waiting for the pain to set in, and it really hasn't yet. So
yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not hoping for it. I mean, I'm hoping that the stock market investors have actually calculated that when he says 145%, that's not going to last, and so they don't go crazy over it. When he says 25% tariff on Apple, which he did in the last few days, it caused a 3% drop, but it seems like that sort of leveled out. So I think there's been a recognition that you can't trust even the worst things that he says, that they're going to stick, that he'll change if he feels like there's a change in the wind. So I mean, none of this is real policy. All of this is just grievance and whim that's driving the guy. Which, again, it takes me to sort of the last thing, which is, and I want to sort of say, I'm really grateful that everyone is here. I mean, how important it is for us all to stay engaged. I know it's not easy. I surely get from my subscribers, and I'm assuming your public notice subscribers, you pick up that there's a lot of stress and distress and maybe despair. People feeling like they're going to give up, that they just can't take it anymore. One of the people here said, I'm mad as hell. I mean, my thing is stay engaged. My thing is you've got to stay involved right now. And, if you're mad as hell, don't have a fight with your spouse, channel the energy and,
Mhm.
and write something, or channel
Yep.
your energy and have a conversation that gets you somewhere. Do the things that can be positive and can make a difference. And so, I mean, I guess my last question for you is, if you sort of look ahead at the coming months, do you think that with public notice and the work you're doing, do you think it's going to change at all in terms of where you're focusing your attention, or do you think the effort is really to do exactly what you've been doing?
Well, we've had to kind of roll with the punches a little bit in that, these past few months, we've been doing a lot more legal explainers than I ever really anticipated. And part of that is I have some really great legal affairs correspondents who I collaborate with. But, part of it is that for reasons that we talked about earlier, like that's where a lot of the conflict is happening right now. And like a lot of the important questions are
Right,
being resolved, the efforts to kind of stymie Trump. So, we have to kind of roll with the punches in that way where, for instance, I have a big explainer coming tomorrow on the House, the spending bill that they just passed last week, and like how that's actually going to impact people on the ground, and it's kind of explaining the state of play where it now goes to the Senate, and there's some senators that want even deeper cuts, and some who want to kind of not hurt their constituents quite as Josh Hawley being an example where he's been sounding the alarm about Medicaid cuts and that would hurt people in Missouri. So we try to be kind of responsive. I mean, one thing that I've kind of realized is that I think more so than ever, there are people who are kind of triggered by Trump where they don't want to read that much about him, like so we try to find ways to tell stories that are obviously relevant to what Trump is doing, that don't focus directly on him, that are more, for instance, we did a big explainer today on Harvard, the attacks on Harvard, but we kind of tackled that from more of like how that's working its way through the courts, and I used for banner image an image of a protest that happened yesterday, not one of Trump. And so
right.
try to be responsive to the demands of my audience in little ways like that. But I'm not exactly sure what the coming months are going to bring. I mean, certainly, I think the summer is going to be kind of consumed by this reconciliation bill, and what the Senate is going to do in the weeks to come. I think is going to
Right.
be. We can think back on 2017 and the repeal of the ACA that didn't happen because of the John McCain, the very famous thumbs down on the Senate floor. We could be setting ourselves up possibly for another moment kind of like that, because I think a lot of the conversation about the reconciliation bill has been quite abstract, and I don't think people have really internalized that it's going to hurt them or people in their communities. And so I foresee that being a big topic this summer, and beyond that, I wish I knew
Yeah.
the horrors that we're in for, but we'll just kind of roll with the punches.
Right, I hear you. I think the one thing that I will say, because I've been hearing from some readers that say, like, I just can't take it anymore, right? And I understand it. I mean, I think you and I have a responsibility to continue to chronicle as much of this as we can and give people the ability to make sense of it, to try to understand it as much as we can. I didn't go to law school. Maybe I should have, right? It would position me better to deal with our current reality. Luckily, there are a lot of smart analysts that help us. But it strikes me that in this moment, I am planning to focus more attention on the opposition, on the creative opposition, on protests, on people who are speaking out and who are standing up and doing so courageously. I'm with the tagline essentially that courage is contagious. I do think that that's something that we all can do as a way to encourage people to hang in there, speak out, and do what you can to be able to get us through this, because we are going to get through this. And if I can say one more thing, I've been doing a lot of research going back to Emancipation Proclamation and the period right after the Civil War, where enslaved people now had freedom, and trying to figure out what that meant. And then the period of Reconstruction after that, where there was a lot of violence by the KKK toward black legislators and black voters and so forth, and kind of terrorizing that was going on in the country. And all of that, besides being fascinating, it reminds me that we have been through worse in our history, right? Americans have had tougher times before, so it's important to keep some sense of context about as tough as these times are, Americans have gotten through worse. So, we
Mhm.
should all just sort of, kind of keep our cool, stick together, and, we're going to get through this.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and I think it's important for people to also remember that we're basically, I mean, to put it charitably to the Republican side, it's a 50-50 country. If not, I think we've seen that there's an anti-Trump coalition that is larger than the Trump coalition. It's just a matter of kind of keeping it together, which we failed to do last year. But because I think the forces of Trumpism want people to kind of believe that, oh, he has this overwhelming mandate and he won all the swing states, and now and the Democratic Party is dead, and that's really not the case. I mean, I think the key thing is to get to the next election that we have with as much of our democracy intact as possible, so that so that kind of the normal ebbs and flows of politics can resume, hopefully within like a more narrow bandwidth where we don't have these wild swings toward authoritarianism every time a Republican wins. But yeah, you're right that people need to stay engaged, and I think one of the most effective ways to do it, especially if you're in a purple state, is to put pressure on, especially Republicans, but in some instances Democrats too, to kind of hold the line, and make sure that they know that if they take votes that are harming their constituents, that there will be accountability for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I echo everything that you said.
So, if you haven't checked out and subscribed to Aaron's public notice, please do. If you haven't checked out My America America and subscribe, please do. Aaron, thank you so much for the conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Stephen, really great to connect with you, and I hope we have a chance to do it again down the line.
My pleasure. And thanks for everyone for being here.
Bye bye.
Bye.